Okay, so now we move on to our guest on Zoom, Dan. So over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, everyone. I think, well, first of all, I think I'd like to just introduce myself a bit because I was introduced today as being a leading proponent of plant-based diets. But I tend to not frame it that way. I tend to not really talk about individual diets of what I should be doing as an individual and what you should be doing as an individual, because we're not in a world where we have that luxury to be talking about what is our individual response. We've had years and years of being just pummeled with all of this greenwashing nonsense that's put things onto the individual and what we can do. But we're in a system which is amidst collapse right now. And what we need to be assessing is what is it that we can do collectively together? How is it we can transform our systems so that we can actually have a livable future? So that's what I want to talk about today, is about this systemic, deep-rooted change that we need within food and farming, and also within, all corners of our society, whether it's economy, politics, or so on. And to kind of like lead into that, I think it's important to really ground ourselves. I'm sure many people here are well aware of the situation with the climate and nature emergency, but I always feel that coming into this conversation, it's important to remind ourselves and to really feel it, the really dangerous situation that we're in. And actually, I don't know. I found that there's a lovely quote by Boris Johnson, of all people, which I think sums it up, the despairing situation we're in quite well. And I think it means something that's coming from someone like Boris Johnson. It's not just coming from the environmentalist. And what this quote says is, we will see desertification, drought, crop failure, and mass movements of humanity on a scale not seen before. Not because of some unforeseen natural event or disaster, but because of us, because of what we are doing now. And our grandchildren will know that we are the culprits and that we were warned. And they will know that it was this generation that came center stage to speak and act on behalf of posterity, and that we missed our cue. And they will ask themselves what kind of people we were to be so selfish and so short-sighted. And that's coming from a man in government who then said that and then did absolutely fuck all when he was in government. And then people who followed him went on to go do fuck all. So I'm sure he will, I hope that, at some stage he remembers that and feels bad about the lack of action he's taken. But we're in 2023 now. And we've just passed 1.5 degrees, which is what we've been being told for years that we absolutely cannot pass. This is the first year we've passed 1.5 degrees. That's been immediately followed up by the hottest January on record. Last year, we saw ocean temperatures accelerate in ways that look incredibly scary if you look at it on a graph, because it's drastically different, and the temperature rise has been drastically different from all previous years. And it really seems to me, looking at it like with a layman's eyes, that we're nearing or entering into tipping points. We're seeing the same kind of drastic shift in 2023 around Antarctic sea ice cover. 2023 was a drastically different year to years previously. So we're really getting to that stage now where things are beginning to really, that cliff edge, which we've been talking about for so long, is coming closer and closer, if not, we've already reached it. In response to this, you've had climate scientists like James Hansen, who's one of the key leading climate scientists, says we've entered into a new climate frontier. Looking at that data, he said we're now in a new climate frontier. We've heard other people talk about we're being in the age of consequences. And with respect to these tipping point situations, we've actually had last year, Peter Kalmu, who many people here may have heard of or may know from Scientists Rebellion, he went to a massive meeting amongst NASA scientists, and privately he was told that and he posted this as a whistleblower, that in this meeting people were talking about that they think, looking at the analysis of the Amazon rainforest, that they've actually already passed tipping points in the Amazon rainforest, and actually we're entering into that phase where it can no longer self-sustain itself. And with a lot of these things, it's being said privately, and then a couple years later it starts surfacing in the scientific papers. Just because it takes time to get these things written up and published and past the journal board and so on. And so, of course, we know what this means in practice. We're seeing, recently Chile, the president of Chile called 2 days of national mourning because they've just had their worst wildfires in history, and killed like over 120 people. We've seen state of emergencies in California for droughts. And, there's just endless of these really devastating things that's happening. And of course, the farming industry is on the forefront of a lot of this damage to the climate. They're the ones who are seeing the extreme weather and seeing the crop failures and so on and so forth that's coming through. So I guess that's where that's what kind of brings me here today before you. It's this situation which is my only motivation. Like, as when I was young, I was a law student. I was, planning for a career in human rights. I ended up actually diverting from that and working in a hospice. And it was the accelerating situations, both within, there's a lot of things wrong in the world, and I was drawn into a lot of things, but really it's the climate emergency that got me. And I guess, like many of us here, I imagine, have just been gripped by this really important generational opportunity to make change. So in that sense, really, I've just got no skin in the game other than just wanting to actually have a future, because I'm 31 years old and I see this coming in my lifetime and in my future child's lifetime, because I'm also trying for a baby. So I will say one fact, which I think is enormously scary in terms of what's coming, which is that by 2040s, it's estimated that there's going to be a 50% chance of multi-bread basket failure. And multi-bread basket failure means that all of your major grain-producing regions around the world, or multiple of them, have crop failure at the same time. And when that happens, we're already seeing massive crop failures in grain-producing regions, but it tends to be in one place at a time. And we often have food stores to back it up. But over time, those food stores have been depleting. And what we're expecting, is by 2040s, there to be a 50% chance that these things will go at the same time, in which case you're having really major global starvation incidents. And, we're already experiencing here the effects of rising food prices from all kinds of stuff. And so I guess I want to raise that because I think what the message is like, we need to sort out our farming systems, or we're not going to be able to grow any food at all. Like, those are the two choices. So this is an existential crisis for farming, and farming has a role to play in solving this stuff, but they can't do it alone. They need all of us with them. They need government action. They need decent policy, not all the crap policy that Robin's been alluding to already. And I'm fully with him in all of the critiques that he's made on a lot of the stuff that's already being done. So anyway, so this, I guess, turns me to animal farming and fishing. And well, what do I want to say here? So I think it's interesting because I think for many years this issue has been avoided by the environment, by the climate movement, by the nature movement. It's been one of those inconvenient choices, inconvenient truth, sorry, that people have felt like they can ignore and brush to one side, because often it's come with that sense of, oh, does that mean I have to change? Does that mean my life has to change? It's very easy just to rail against the system, railing against fossil fuels. Oh, we can have green energy. Maybe stuff doesn't change that much, but the food and farming has always felt very personal. It's been very emotive. And for a long time, it was ignored. But over time, particularly as this growing climate situation has gotten worse and worse, it's become harder and harder to ignore these truths. So I'll throw out some studies and facts which really highlight kind of where the scientific consensus is at with respect to the absolute damage being caused here. So firstly, there's in 2019, for the first time in history, the UN brought together the top scientists from the IPCC. So those are the guys who do the climate reports every year from the UN. And then from the IPBES, which is the equivalent of the IPCC, but for biodiversity loss and mass extinction. So you bring together basically the scientists studying mass extinction and the scientists studying climate collapse. And for the first time ever, they brought them into the room in 2019. And they said, how do we solve this problem how do we solve them both together? Because some climate solutions will harm nature and some nature solutions can harm your climate. So they said, what we need is solutions that actually can solve both at the same time. And what the scientists said, and there's like a 250 odd page report of this, and the summary is that we need nature-based solutions, which by that they meant the key thing that we can do is rewild our ecosystems, is restore our ecosystems. So that's on the land, your forests, your wetlands, your peat bogs, etc. And in the oceans, it's allowing a flourishing ocean ecosystem. And in that report, they said, but we can't do that because animal farming's taking up all the land and fishing's tearing all life out of the ocean. So we can't do it because that's in the way. And it amazes me that this actually is a report that hasn't really been acknowledged much, because it really is, to me, it's one of the most legitimate reports because it's the IPCC and the nature people as well. It's both of these two existential crises being dealt with, and that's what they came up with. And that finding has been repeated as well. So next study I want to turn to is Oxford University. This is in 2018. This is the largest study to date that's ever looked at the relationship between food and farming. They surveyed 38,000 farms over 40 different types of food. That's animal-based food and plant-based foods. And what they found is on every single plant-based food, even the worst performing plant-based foods were actually had less climate impacts than the best kind of animal-based foods. So your best, steak that you could ever make from a climate point of view was worse than the worst kind of, say, tofu, for instance. But where this study really came into its own was that they looked at if you were to transition globally to a plant-based food system, that we could actually free up 76% of global farmland. 76% of global farmland could be freed up and returned back to nature. And what that actually equates to is the size of the European Union, Australia, China, and the United States combined. It boggles the mind, the actual size of land that we could be restoring for nature, and it's being taken up by this industry. And that doesn't include, all of the ocean that we're tearing up in the fishing industry. And what they said is when you account for the sequestration potential from bringing back that wilderness, we could actually reduce our emissions effectively by over 70%. Because you're not only losing the emissions from the production, But you're also, if you count in what you're drawing down from restoring those forests, it totals up to over 70% of emissions reduction. And this is the really big failure in a lot of the way that people are talking about the food emissions problem. Like Robin mentioned the Henry Dimbleby report, which said 1/3 of emissions comes from our food system. That doesn't account for the opportunity cost of what we could have there instead. Once you include that opportunity cost, the number just absolutely skyrockets, and it's essential to take that into account. And this is why, like, I'm sure many people here are environmental. That's why George Monbiot has, shifted over suddenly being super hard on pushing for this plant-based transition. It's because of that single fact and that single thing which has been overlooked, and he saw it, and that's why he's so passionately on this issue. Last quick one I will say is Harvard University. They published a study, can't remember when it was now, a few years ago, where they looked at the UK and they looked at how it is we can transition to a plant-based food system in the UK and what benefits that would have. And they found that in the UK, we could free up close to 50, I think it's 48% of farmland. 48% of farmland and restore that to nature, and feed everyone, and become net negative in our emissions. One fell swoop, the UK could become net negative in emissions if we transition to a plant-based food system and rewild the freed up land. There are countless of these studies. These are only a handful. You also have, you can look at this issue from many other different angles, whether that's, methane emissions or fresh water use or water pollution or whatever, or species extinction, and any kind of environmental metrics you look at this industry on, and it performs absolutely terribly. And each one on its own shows that we need to have this transition. So I could have given you the same most compelling speech around methane emissions. But there's only so much time. This whole thing about rewilding the land is a really important one, because I was working on this issue for many years before I really actually came to understand this. And like the image that Robin showed of like the view of like sustainable Britain, of those rolling green fields. It's a beautiful image. It's the image that we were brought up with. It's a storybook, idyllic version of what Britain is. But those fields once were forests. And this is the shift of perception that we need to have, is that once upon a time, and this was hundreds of years ago, those forests were cut down. Robin quoted how do we go broke farming, and he said, and he used the quote, regard your woodland as a coal mine and cut it down. That's already happened here. And we're watching it happen in the Amazon, and we're crying about it, seeing it happen, but it's already happened in Britain. Actually, a really interesting thing is the word field. From that is derived from the etymology of the word feld. And the word field actually means a place where the trees have been felled. That's what field means. And we really need to shift our perception of our country and what it is. And it is a barren ecosystem. Like one hedge rolling through a field, that's nothing compared to what there once was and what there could be. And at this stage of collapse, we really need to allow ourselves to imagine what could be and work towards that. Because frankly, that's our only hope to ensure a livable future at this time. So just a couple of notes on like this small farm stuff. Like Robin's right, a large industrial farm is actually more carbon, it's better on a carbon level than a farm like Robin's. And the reason is because of the land use. because it takes up so much land to farm in the way Robin does, and it's that opportunity cost of not having the forest. And it's a it's a bonkers thing to think of. But of course, there's not me advocating those big farms. Those big farms are absolute hellholes, and I've been inside them. And it's just the worst thing you could ever imagine in your life. And they're still causing all kinds of problems, whether it's polluting the River Wye, as we're seeing at the moment, and just animals suffer greatly. So it's like the big farms that are better, supposedly, they're still terrible for the environment, but they're better than what is being called sustainable. And the people who are advocating regenerative animal farming and regenerative grazing and all of this stuff, it's really important to say there is no science there. For a while, this was being pumped out, and people were really taking it on board and thinking that it was valid. But at this stage, it's all been debunked. Even the WWF, who's a very, very conservative environmental organization, now put out that the science just isn't there. And I actually had a conversation with the CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust a couple of years ago, who advocates for regenerative grazing. And I said to him, how do you continue to advocate for this when you know that there's no science? And his response to me, oh, there will be the science there, but they just haven't done the right studies yet. We really need to overcome this denial. They've been trying to produce that science for years, and it's not there. And the people who are pushing this message and saying it's there, no, it's not there. And I don't think they're doing it for some are, the industry are doing it for bad reasons, because they just want profit. But some people are doing it just because, understandably, they're trying to protect something, trying to protect culture, and that's fully understandable. But we need to protect more than just, we need to protect all of us here. You can die protecting your rural culture if you want, but you're still going to die, and everyone's going to go with you. We need to wake up to the situation, and it's a hard pill to follow. And I must say, I do have a great respect for farming communities as I say this, and that's why I say it so bluntly. Because I think, I quite respect salt of the earth farmers, really, in that, you can speak directly. So with all of this in mind, I mean, the good news is that things are starting to change now. Things really are ramping up. So we're seeing, like, over the last couple of years, 10 universities have voted to have 100% plant-based catering on their campuses. We're expecting actually this year that to be followed up by another like 15 or 20 universities. Councils and cities across the UK and the world are passing motions to transition to plant-based catering within their facilities and to change their food and farming. Amsterdam recently endorsed the plant-based treaty, which advocated for full-scale transition to plant-based food system. 25 million people around the world are estimated to have participated in Veganuary this year. And we're seeing governments taking action as well, with Denmark, Netherlands, South Korea really acting on trying to bring about this transition. And I think it must be said that those there are some organizations in the farming world, and I will name the NFU. Most farmers are pissed off with the NFU. I'm just going to, from my understanding, I talk to a lot of farmers. And the NFU, in my view, by continuing to push the denial that this stuff can continue, that animal farming can continue and nothing needs to change, they're letting farmers down. They're sending them down the river. Because what they need is support to change, because the change is coming no matter what. And as long as this denial is pumped out, the more farmers are going to get screwed over. They need people in their corner who's seeing that society is changing and is willing to step up for that, not just burying their heads in the sand. Now, I would just say a couple more words, because I feel like I'm probably coming to the end of my time. I think we're actually in a massive problem in the climate movement. Because as much as I've said, there's good stuff happening and there's changes happening. Most of these changes, whether it's in the farming sector or in, the transition away from fossil fuels or whatever it is, this is all being implemented by governments that are often doing this at the cost of ordinary people. So they're making new policies which are, developed on a desk somewhere in London, and then are done with the view of putting the cost and putting the burden of change on ordinary people who are already struggling tremendously. And this is really, really clear with the farming industry, with local farmers, struggling so much already. They're absolutely from rising costs to low pay to supermarkets screwing them over. There's so many problems in farming, and it really needs a massive shake-up and a massive revitalization. That can only be done with real input from government to really take this on and sort this mess out. But instead, what they're doing is when they are trying to do things in farming, they're doing things that just make it worse. And they're throwing really crap, half environmental measures and asking farmers to do those. And then no wonder farmers are fighting back against it, because one, they see it doesn't work, and two, it's just costing them more money, and three, they're on the brink anyway. And, and there's a massive mental health crisis in farming. So I've been looking at a lot of farmer protests recently, and I'd say I'm concerned that we as a movement are failing. We as a climate movement are failing because, and not only in the farming space, but in other spaces too, because we've been so focused on just trying to ask governments to act because we desperately need action. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to the fact that when they do act, because they're driven by this neoliberal thing and unwilling to challenge the fundamental structures in our society and the wealth inequality and the corporate power and all of that stuff, when they do act, they're doing it in a way that's hurting people, and people are going to fight back against it. And that is why you're getting a lot of these populist rebellions, I think, that we're seeing happening like across Europe and so on. So I don't know how we make this transition happen. For farmers to be done in a fair way. It has to be done in a fair way. It has to be in a way that involves them and includes them, and that they're part of the conversation, their dignity is respected, and rural culture is protected. I don't know how we do that with a government that I know if they take on this issue, they're going to fuck it up. But we need to figure out somehow how to do it. So I think that's really what we need to think of as a climate movement. Is not just asking for action, but thinking of actually what action we're actually given and whether it's, going to deliver on what we need and what everyone, what individuals need who are, having to change. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate the time.
Probably just time for a couple of questions for Dan, if anybody's got any, but we will need to move on fairly quickly, I think, because we want to finish by 1, and we want to leave time for a discussion at the end as well. So does anybody have any questions for Dan? Ricky again?
Well, sorry, I really would like to ask you, thank you very much, by the way, that was good stuff. Again, what can we do as a group to promote the plant-based treaty campaign?
Well, for plant-based treaty, I don't know. You have to go and speak to them, but they're very accessible if you want to reach out. Like it's a really great initiative, actually, plant-based treaty, and it's they're getting a lot of endorsements around the world. One of the things that we're doing from Animal Rising, which we have a campaign called Plant-Based Councils, where we're asking for councils to transition to 100% plant-based catering, as well as some other initiatives. And we're really trying to get that institutional endorsement from councils across the country to say, yes, we will change what we do as a signal of what we need to happen. We've had 5 wins so far, and actually last month we've kind of just massively galvanized the campaign, and we're setting up groups all over the country. So I think Brian's actually in conversations with people around setting up a group locally, if you want to get involved. I think it's a really powerful thing, and there's a lot of energy behind that campaign at the moment. And I think we're in 2024. I think there's going to be a whole snowball. So we're reaching that domino point of lots of councils really taking this on. So I think it's going to snowball across the country.
Well, thanks a lot for that, Deb.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask all three of you really briefly, because it's been fascinating that we've had, you know, the livestock farmer and the sort of plant-based advocate, and then permaculture that kind of straddles both of them. So I just wondered, when you were listening to the other speakers today, whether you had a moment where you felt particularly incensed at what you hear, took a minute to kind of say, to sort of give a kind of rebuttal.
I'm quite happy to start. All right.
Go on, Robin.
No, I don't ever get that way anymore, I'm afraid. Look, we're fortunate. We live in a democracy, probably the ultimate form of democracy. Free speech is still possible and so on. And it's quite reasonable. Everyone has slightly different ideas. What to me seems quite incredible, once you listen to Queenus, I think, is that amount of common ground that we have. First of all, that understanding of the challenges that we face, really. Secondly, is probably a slightly different interpretations of how we manage it, though, where, you know, Dan is looking at a much more definitive direction at one end. Mine is kind of looking at a more incremental change in management to look at where we get to the best stage. For example, the trees, the land that was cleared in the 1970s and 80s at the end of that capital program of land improvement in the UK. The last to be cleared is probably the stuff that's the first that needs to be gradually returned. And we will get to a point where we have a balance, hopefully, in my mind. That's kind of what's happening on my farm. So, no, yeah, occasionally there's going to be a few spots to think, no, don't agree with that. But I don't think I get to that point. I want to get hold of the throttle. Sorry, even somebody like you, you're safe from that. I'm pretty resilient. I've survived this long.
We go to Dan next then. Anything you've been incensed by, Dan, that you've heard from?
No, I'm the same as Robin. I don't really get incensed. There was a time in my life when I did, and you know, I would get quite fiery about this stuff. I personally just am of a view of we need to have the conversation. We need to get the different viewpoints out there. I can be quite direct in how I come across, but also, like, I'm ashamed. It's a shame that I'm not there today, because, like, I think it would be really good for me and Robin to always have a conversation, because, like, we're a lot more than our viewpoints on this subject. And what I can tell very clearly is that he's a lovely guy. And I think, like, we need more conversation, not less. I don't think it helps to get angry at each other and then separate off into our little bubbles.
You got a comment, Tim?
Yeah, so I guess I often find like the sort of rewilding thing a bit annoying, and I kind of feel that there's like a middle ground where you can graze your livestock underneath trees, and you've got the carbon going into the ground, you've got the carbon going into the trees, you've got whatever you're growing as a crop from the trees, whether it's timber or fruit or something, and you can actually have, if this is statistic, you like this, you can have 30% tree cover in a field and not actually reduce the amount of grazing that's available, because you've got the shelter, you've got the, you know, some of the grass is protected by from the intense sun in the middle of the summer and stuff like that. So there's a way that you can sort of produce food and produce livestock within something that's halfway to being a woodland that is being, you know, it's creating a good habitat and it's sequestering a lot of carbon. So I guess that's the nearest thing to riling me up, I suppose.
Okay, Rosie.
I found all the presentations really interesting, and thank you so much. But I'm rather sort of concerned about how you move into plant-based diet with food grown in the UK. I've been told by some people that you can actually grow plants anywhere, and you can even grow them in the places where Robin thinks that you just can only grow grass, and that it is actually possible to grow vegetables in places where cattle are grown at the moment. And I think that's a really interesting idea, and I just wonder if any one of you has any ideas about the sort of possibility of that, and if it's really okay, sustainable to do that. And or do we have to actually move to a greenhouse culture where everything has to be undercover? Roger Hallam started off as a farmer, but he just gave up after so many weeks and months of really difficult weather. So where do you move to? I mean, maybe Robin is right. Maybe you can only grow things there because the weather's so awful in some places. But there must be other parts of Britain where the weather isn't quite so bad, where they're growing cows and where you could actually grow plants instead. Anyway, I'd like your comments on the possibilities of growing plants where animals have previously been grown.
That's got to be one for Dan, isn't it?
Yeah, I can come in there. I'll be interested to hear other views as well. I think it's the problem is a very complex situation, and land, every bit of land's different in terms of what it is you can do with it, and it's not like a one size fits all solution. And I think that's where you're kind of getting at in the question as well. So really, I think what needs to be done, and this hasn't been done yet, is a proper, thorough evaluation of what we could grow where in the UK under that plant-based food system model. One thing I would say is I think what we need is a combination. It was mentioned about importance of not being dogmatic about stuff. It's like we need food that's grown in the UK. We need food that's grown out of the UK that's imported, because that helps you be resilient to global, if you get extreme weather events in one area, you have supply chains that can keep you fed. You also probably need some, vertical farming operations as well. I think what we need is more diversity in order to build resilience against an increasingly uncertain set of extreme weather. Because it might be the case that, we just can't, just grow everything in the old ways like we used to. If you're going to get destroyed by a flood, and then everyone starves. So it needs to be. It's a very complex problem, and it needs lots of solutions. I think, not just one.
My name's Peter. I'm sure this is going to be difficult for you to answer, but since the days of Margaret Thatcher and deregulation of the financial system, there's so much common ground between you all, and we're all mainly all green people, but actually our lives are mainly controlled by the hedge fund people and the bean counters. And I've worked in big industry. I come from a little small shop in North Devon, so my background is farming. I hear wonderful things, but how are we going to change the mindsets or get into the minds of the people to shift things in the way that you're talking about? Because without that, I just think we're lost, because they control nearly every aspect of our lives, hedge funds and the connected systems. And the idea at all, Dan, I've been out on the streets, I've got arrested, but it hasn't done a lot of good other than raise awareness.
There's a question.
Mm.
Do you want to comment on that, Dan?
Yeah,
question?
I'll just say something briefly, which is just that, I mean, yeah, who knows how we're going to solve this stuff? I mean, right now, to me, the most likely direction of where we're going politically is towards fascism. And you know, we've got massive, like, you know, with just all of our institutions are amidst major stress, aren't working, people are pissed off, and the only real solution that's being offered to people of something different, of an alternative, because people are searching out for an alternative right now, is the right wing. They're the only people that are offering something, and the left haven't offered anything that's comprehensive. All we've done is push issues, like we pushed the climate issue or this issue or that issue. But what we need, I think, is a way to really tie this together in a program of actually real meaningful change across society as a whole. And I think this is what kind of comes to my point that I said earlier about, like, if the politicians try and do it within the current arrangement and within the current system, they're going to do it in a way that's going to hurt ordinary people, and it's going to fuel the rising inequality and all of that kind of stuff. And then people are going to backlash against that, and they're going to backlash against the climate agenda, and then that's going to fuel the right-wing fascism. So to me, the only hope is to work on building alternative, progressive forms of politics that can combat the rise of fascism that we're currently seeing in the UK and around the world. Don't know how to do that, but that's kind of where I'm looking towards next.